Hi, this is Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, joined by Sheldon Richman, the vice president for the foundation, and this is the Libertarian Angle. Sheldon, obviously the big story this week is what happened in Boston. And there's so many different angles to this. Of course, you know, we're not going to get the libertarian angle in the mainstream press, which is why we have this show. But, you know, there's the blowback from U.S. foreign policy that the mainstream media scrupulously tries to avoid talking about, along with U.S. officials. There's the gun control aspect, you know, where people are cowering in their houses without the ability to defend themselves against people like this. There's the issue of the Miranda warnings, enemy combatant theory. So I'll just throw out the first one, the blowback. I blogged on this Friday and then again today that it's increasingly clear that what we're looking at is people that got filled with anger and rage over the death and destruction that the U.S. national security state has wreaked in Afghanistan and continues to do so, Iraq, the drone assassinations. We've been saying this since 9/11, since before 9/11, that unless the U.S. government stops doing this over in that part of the world, you're going to have people engaging in these retaliatory strikes. And they keep leading us down this primrose path of, oh, no, just leave us here. We'll kill all the terrorists. And they've been killing people to their heart's content in these countries for 11, 12 years now. And yet we still now see the anger and rage boiling over into where people do these kind of things. And so I intimated in my blog, why do Americans get surprised over this? Americans get angry when these innocent people are killed in Boston on 9/11. Why would foreigners or people of Muslim faith be any less angry when their wedding parties are bombed and their friends are killed? And let's keep in mind that everybody they killed in Iraq had nothing to do with 9/11, and most of the people they've killed in Afghanistan had nothing to do with 9/11. Sheldon, I say it's time to end this thing. It's just not worth all this death and destruction. It's great they caught these guys or killed them before they could do more mayhem. But the sad reality is those people are still dead from the Boston Marathon. They're now living without arms or legs. And is it worth it to have the national security state have this hegemony, interventionism, imperialism? I say it's not worth it at all. It's time to dismantle this Cold War artifact. What do you think?
Well, I believe we'll find that as more and more information comes out of that at the base of their motivation is this anger and resentment about how U.S. policy treats Muslims, and not just in the Middle East, not just Arabs, but like say Afghans, Pakistanis, and Somalians, and I think it's going to be very difficult to come up with a better explanation. Acknowledgement of this fact came from an unlikely source over the weekend on CNN when former Bush administration Attorney General Alberto Gonzales acknowledged, sort of even unsolicited, that U.S. foreign policy causes resentment among Muslims and a desire for vengeance or a desire to strike out at the United States. That's pretty interesting. You don't often hear people from the Bush administration say that. You'll recall that when in 2008, when Ron Paul pointed this out as a reason for 9/11, or as the reason for 9/11, he was ridiculed, mocked and ridiculed across the board by Rudy Giuliani most memorably. But of course, even some official documents have said this very same thing. The official 9/11 Commission report talked about U.S. foreign policy as creating resentment against the United States among Muslims, and it was also in at least one DOJ study. So this is not totally hushed up. It is mentioned occasionally, but if you say it in public, you're bound to be dismissed. And so it's very interesting, and I'm writing about this too. One of the first things Obama said after the bombing was that we'll find out why they did this. We'll find out who did it and why they did it. And naturally, people's first question is why did they do this? So there's an interest in motive. There's a natural interest in knowing the motives for criminal activity, especially when it's something really terrible like this. The question is, how long will that interest last when it becomes undeniably clear that it was resentment against U.S. foreign policy and the treatment of Muslims abroad. I have a feeling I made a prediction that official interest in the motive will disappear when we have, crystal clear indication that that was the motive, and then Americans won't want to hear about it either. They'll just want to shout USA, 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 and that's the last we'll hear of discussion of motives, I believe, and that will be tragic.
Yeah, well, I read in the Washington Post yesterday where a friend of theirs who lives in the same building had a conversation with the older brother. And the older brother had said during this conversation that was over the Bible and American foreign policy, according to the Post, that it was because of the deaths that the U.S. government was wreaking over in that part of the world that he was angry about. So I think it's clear that it's pointing in that direction. And I think you're right, that people don't want to confront this because the way I've always put it is that Americans, especially American Christians, they've come to view the national security state as like a god, an idol. You're not supposed to question this, that whatever the national security state decides, invading Iraq, we defer to their authority. And in Afghanistan, that the military means is the best way to do things because the national security state says so. And so when all of a sudden things start to point in the direction that, hey, their deity, their little idol may be the cause of this, I think it's going to freak out the statists. And I think you're absolutely right let's move on. Let's not talk about this anymore because nothing can prevent. I mean, the last thing they want is a discussion on whether this whole paradigm of interventionism, imperialism, all these overseas bases, the invasions, occupations, torture, rendition, kidnappings, is all worth this death and destruction. I say it's not. I say it's time to close the bases, dismantle this Cold War artifact, the national security state. It's a cancer on the body politic. It's sending us into bankruptcy. It's bringing death and destruction to our land, anger and rage. This is not what America was founded on, Sheldon.
It does show the whole thing is bankrupt, and I think we also have to throw in, acknowledge as a source of resentment and anger and desire for vengeance is the occupation of Palestine, which is totally backed and financed and bankrolled by the U.S. government. Hagel's over there right now promising big new arms deal for Israel, allegedly because of Iran and its non-existent nuclear weapons program. So, they're doubling down. Peter King, a U.S. representative from New York, Republican, has said this just shows how we have to double down on our global foreign policy. I mean, so they're going to use it to justify the very policy and reinforce the very policy that brings this kind of thing about. It's definitely true that this is what is going to get people mad. It's hard to imagine other motivations for this sort of thing. I mean, people pointed out that they're Chechens, ethnically Chechens, but Chechny's beef is with the Russians, not with us. It's a separatist. It's a republic that wants to be separated from Russia, and since the U.S. is not seen as buddies with Russia, it doesn't make sense that Chechens would strike out at Americans in that nationalist cause. That doesn't make much sense. There's talk about these guys being involved or knowing organized crime figures who are Chechen but living in the United States, living in Cambridge. But this doesn't really have the mark of organized crime. Why would they bomb the Boston Marathon? That doesn't make any sense. So we'll see. I mean, things are often there are many factors involved. We'll see as more and more information comes out. But it seems right now that the best explanation is it was a desire to strike out at Americans for their government's foreign policy. That doesn't make it a correct action. It's immoral. They just murdered people indiscriminately. But we do want to understand it for a couple of reasons. It's worth understanding for its own sake, but it's also worth understanding to see how we can avoid this sort of thing in the future. I mean, everybody wants to say we got to avoid future terrorism. We got to prevent future terrorism. And nobody wants to talk about the most efficient way to do it, which is what you were just saying. End this policy that makes people mad at us. I mean, it can be simple and still be true, the answer.
Yeah, and then you've got the whole, reaction to it. Oh, we can put cops now at all these sporting events, and, we can have cops everywhere and cameras everywhere, and people celebrate this. The more controls, the more clampdown there is, the more people celebrate it as freedom. which is really bizarre to me. I mean, as libertarians, we understand that the more the government's clamping down on people, cops everywhere, this is a police state. That's not freedom. And so you not only have the anger and rage resulting in death and destruction to American citizens, you also have the loss of freedom that comes with this policy at the hands of our own government that is trying to keep us safe from the very threats that its policies are producing. Hey, but I wanted to throw out the other thing, which I found kind of interesting, was the gun control aspect of this, because you have this massive lockdown where it was effectively a variation of martial law, as far as I'm concerned, where everybody's ordered to stay in their homes, and if they don't go in there, if they go out, they're subject to being shot because they may be mistaken for escaping terrorists or something. But I couldn't help but think, Sheldon, because Massachusetts is a big gun control state, and I couldn't help but think that how many of those families were sitting there cowering in their homes, disarmed, no weapons, wishing that they had a shotgun at least, maybe an automatic, semi-automatic, an AR-15 or something, to defend themselves against the guy that clearly, or two guys, that clearly were not obeying gun control laws in Massachusetts.
No, I think that's true. It makes a mockery of that whole appeal. If I had been living in Watertown during that period, I would have been very happy to have a gun in my house. I would have felt good that I had a gun in my house. And the whole martial law aspect, I think you're right on point. It was martial law. There are reports that people were threatened with being shot if they stuck their heads out windows. In some cases, people were actually forced out of their homes. We heard reports that they were ordered to stay in their homes, but there are pictures of people being taken out of their homes. So all kinds of weird things, and it does look like they finally caught Dzhokhar Tsarnaev after they ended the lockdown, and the guy and a homeowner was allowed to step out of his house to smoke a cigarette. That's when he noticed blood around his boat. So it wasn't until the lockdown, the martial law ended, that they got a clue to where this guy was hiding out. So it's I think we have seen a lot on display as a result of this event. The question is, will people draw the obvious and I think true lessons from it? And I'm a little worried that they won't. We'll see.
No, but it really goes to show that the state cannot keep you safe all the time. I mean, we've argued this, is that you ultimately have to take responsibility for your own safety and your own security. And nothing would have made me feel better if that had happened here in Virginia than to be able to sit in my house with an assault rifle or a shotgun or a semi-automatic pistol. And if the guy comes in the door or through a window, I have the ability to defend myself. I mean, these people that didn't have that ability, to me, it's absolutely incredible. It really goes to show, like you say, it's a mockery of the whole gun control debate. Another big aspect of this whole thing, Sheldon, is this enemy combatant doctrine that, Lindsey Graham and McCain and a few others are over there. This is absolutely incredible. It really goes to show what the national security state and the war on terrorism have done to Americans, is that they're saying that the U.S. government should treat this guy as an enemy combatant. He's an American citizen, keep in mind, and which means that they don't have to go through any due process. They can do what they initially did with American citizen Jose Padilla, avoid the Bill of Rights, take the guy away, torture him into giving information, into confessing and whatever, for as long as they want. And then if they finish up with him and he's a vegetable or whatever, then they're saying, then you can reconvert him back to a criminal defendant status like they did with Padilla. This is absolutely an abomination, Sheldon. It really goes to show you where these statists have led us in this country.
I agree. These are crimes. This is not an act of war. Nobody who was involved in this, even if there were other people, could have possibly believed that by setting off bombs at the Boston Marathon, and even if they intended to set off a few more bombs, that was going to bring down the United States, that was going to we would next be overrun, or that the government would surrender and be taken over by a foreign power. And this is not war by any stretch of the imagination. So to call this an act of war is ridiculous. To call these people enemy combatants is ridiculous. And we have to remember that if you loosen the traditional protections that alleged criminals, that suspects get. If you do it in these most celebrated cases where the people are the suspects are so reviled, you can't help but also weaken them for everybody else. And this is something that was pointed out by very good pieces by Glenn Greenwald and Emily Bazelon at Slate magazine. And one thing that's not getting enough attention is that the Obama administration long ago gutted Miranda. They're making a big deal of the fact that they've invoked this Miranda exception, which the Supreme Court carved out in the 80s, which said, for the sake of public safety, you can ask a suspect questions without giving him his Miranda warnings, without telling him he can have a lawyer there, or that he has a right to remain silent. But if the questions are narrowly pitched at the public safety, the original case, known as the Quarles case in the 80s, you had a rape suspect where the victim said that the suspect had a gun during the event, but the suspect, once he was captured, had an empty holster. So the police asked him where his gun was. This eventually went up to the Supreme Court, and they said, well, for the sake of public safety, it was okay if the police asked them that, basically that one question in advance of Miranda warnings and the normal criminal protections. Now, you can argue about whether that exception is reasonable or not reasonable. That's not the point. The point is, in 2011, the Obama administration and Eric Holder, Attorney General, expanded that exception so broadly that it basically guts Miranda altogether. And I'll read it. Let me read a key. This is compliments of Glenn Greenwald. I'll even put it up on the screen if we can do this. Hang on a second. This is a quote from a secret DOJ memo. Let's keep in mind, secret, because the Obama administration would not put it out, but it was leaked. And what it said was, let's see whether we can get it up here. There may be exceptional cases in which, although all relevant public safety questions have been asked, notice that, all relevant public safety questions have been asked, agents nonetheless conclude that continued unwarned interrogation, that means no Miranda warning, is necessary to collect valuable and timely intelligence not related to any immediate threat, and that the government's interest in obtaining this intelligence outweighs the disadvantages of proceeding with unwarned interrogation. That's completely out of the spirit of even the Supreme Court exception, because it was supposed to be strictly about public safety. And here's Obama and Holder saying, no, we can go way beyond imminent threat, public safety, and just gather other information without reading the suspect his Miranda warnings. And the funny thing is, over the weekend, if I was watching MSNBC, the so-called progressive network, it was just totally in the tank for Obama. They never once mentioned that Obama has already destroyed Miranda. It's really very ominous.
Well, and what's fascinating about this is that he rules by decree. He doesn't even go to Congress and say, would you please expand this exception here? He just says, I'm going to rule by decree. And it's that same mindset that Bush was using, that I'm a commander in chief and I'm at war and I can rule by decree just like military dictators do. And this is not a free society when a ruler can do that by decree. At the very least, go to Congress. I still don't think it would be constitutional, but at the very least, go to Congress and seek permission instead of ruling by decree. And, Sheldon, a lot of people ask us, why is it that we as libertarians are often in the position of defending people like these two guys, or Jose Padilla, or and they don't understand. I think it's important that we delve into this, that the reason that we defend principles like this, the Miranda warnings, which are really part of the Fifth Amendment, that protects people from being forced to give confessions, tortured into giving confessions. These were procedural guarantees that go back centuries, and that our American ancestors said, we want to make these protections part of our Constitution. And that's why they demanded that the Bill of Rights be enacted. So you got 4 amendments dealing with the power of government to do bad things to people with respect to these criminal offenses. And so if you deny these protections to the most despicable people, because that's the ones they usually pick on, the ones that have no sympathy, that once they win, then that becomes the law that applies to everybody. So if they can do this to Jose Padilla or this guy, where they can say, oh, we're going to now make you an enemy combatant, even though the U.S. Code clearly says that terrorism is a criminal offense. That's why there's all kinds of criminal prosecutions in the federal court for terrorism. If they can do that to him, and if people say, oh, he's a no-good terrorist, go ahead and do it to him, then they can do it to everybody. And once they can do it to everybody, then you're in no different position from any other dictatorial regime where they now have the power to round people up, cart them away, and torture them, execute them, and so forth. That's a far cry from a free society, Sheldon.
No, we have to keep in mind that as they question him without his having an attorney present and not being told what his rights are in this matter, that's unreviewable because no one else is there who's not with the government. So we won't really know what he's been asked. And if later on he, through an attorney, talks about it, by then it's too late. No one's going to care about it anyway. So this is really it's sort of unreviewable. It's a government that can act secretly without the public scrutiny, and that's obviously very dangerous. Government can't be trusted.
Well, and they normally use the military to do these things. I mean, that's what they did with Padilla. And we now live in a country. The reality is where the military has supremacy over the civil court system. That's the post 9/11 legacy that the statists have given us. In fact, if the Pentagon went into a federal court and said we want to take jurisdiction over this criminal defendant, these federal judges would start quivering and quaking and bow to the military and say, "Oh, here, take him." And that's effectively what they did in the Padilla case. The military took control of this guy. They torture him for 3 years, and then they say, "Oh, by the way, we're just now just switching back to criminal defendant status." Well, the point I've been making time and time again is that if they have this option of treating a criminal defendant as either an enemy combatant or a criminal defendant, then that's essentially the power to ignore the Bill of Rights, the 4th, 5th, 6th, and 8th Amendments. And what a clever, devious way to figure out a way to ignore those rights. Because if they have the option of ignoring the rights, then the rights are a nullity anyway. And we've got to keep in mind, Sheldon, that these rights our American ancestors demanded, these guarantees, these procedural guarantees, because they saw what governments had done throughout history, including their own government, the British government. That term due process of law goes all the way back to Magna Carta, where the barons of England required King John to admit that his powers over them were limited and that he could not go against them in violation of due process, or what they call in violation of the law of the land. And I think it's vitally important for us libertarians to continue raising people's visions to the vital importance of civil liberties to a free society. You can't have a free society without an enshrinement and a protection of these due process guarantees.
And let's remember what's already on the books. I mean, last year the National Defense Appropriation Act has that infamous provision for indefinite detention without any charge or judicial proceeding, and it was quite clear at the time of the discussion when that was being considered that they could use this against American citizens. The only issue is whether Obama had to turn such a suspect over to the military, or did he only have the option? Well, it turns out the language says he has the option to do it, so they could. They could turn him over and put him indefinitely in a military brig, not even ever try or charge him. Now, they probably won't do that, but they could. The fact is, it's on the books. It's just up to Obama's discretion. That should make us all very nervous. And, of course, he's already killed American citizens outside the country by drones. With Olaki and Olaki's son and a couple of others. So they've already gone to the most extreme of actually killing somebody without any sort of due process. So why should we be surprised that they might question with enhanced interrogation techniques, let's say, in other words, torture, when they've already been willing to kill people, and they have on the books the power to indefinitely detain somebody. We should all be very nervous at this time, and it's precisely, you know, in the case of a most reviled suspect, right, and like this, that we have to be most vigilant, because it's easy to get, you know, for people to get caught up in the hysteria and say, well, yeah, well, this guy's obviously so terrible that anything is justified. But you know, I always turn to the famous passage from the great play A Man for All Seasons about Sir Thomas More, where he's in a dialogue with someone who says, are you telling me you give, in effect, I'm paraphrasing, you give the devil due process? And he says, of course I'd give the devil due process, because what are you going to do once all those due process laws have been mown down and the devil turns on you? What are you going to do then? And we need to remember that.
Yeah, and, you know, I think the analogy here is with respect to the First Amendment. That, you know, we defend it's easy to defend the most popular speech. I mean, you know, that doesn't take any big deal. It's the despicable speech that needs to be protected. And I remember many years ago when the ACLU was defending the right of Nazi sympathizers to march in Skokie, Illinois. And people were outraged. How can you let Nazis have free speech and so forth? Well, the principle is that if you don't defend the most despicable speech, then you don't have free speech. I mean, in China, people are free to speak as long as their speech is responsible. And so the principle is the same with respect to these due process guarantees. No matter how despicable the act, no matter how despicable the defendant, is that you've got to have these protections continually enshrined into law in order to protect everybody in society, because you never know when some would-be tyrant takes the reins of power and says, aha, now I'm going to establish order and stability in this country, and I'm going to do it by rounding people up because I now have the power to do so. And let's face it, Sheldon, they have the power to do it. When McCain and these other guys are saying declare him an enemy combatant, it's a policy decision. I mean, that's the big post 9/11 revolution, that they now have this option. And as you point out, they have the option to assassinate Americans. They have the option of treating them like enemy combatants. That's now the law of the land, and that's what needs to be changed. But this brings us back to the original discussion. All this is part and parcel and a consequence of the U.S. national security state, the big standing military, the big overseas empire, the interventionism, the imperialism. That produces the anger and rage that then all of a sudden you have terrorism not just overseas, you know, with the USS Cole and the embassies in East Africa. You got terrorism on American soil, and then they use that as the excuse to start infringing on constitutional protections, ruling by decree. And that's why I keep saying is we've got to stay focused on the big cancer here, and that's this Cold War dinosaur artifact that we know is the national security state. That, to me, is the root of the problem.
I think it is the root of the problem. If anything, this incident shows that invading and occupying countries is not a way to protect yourself from terrorism, because these guys pulled off a bombing, apparently, at the bombings at the Boston Marathon. I mean, all eyes were on the site that they chose on the biggest day in Boston's year, right? Patriots Day, Marathon Day. All eyes are there. They didn't try to hit some other target knowing eyes were on the marathon. They went to where everybody was watching, and they were able to pull that off. To me, that looks like a thumb in the eye of the surveillance state, and so it just shows the whole policy's been bankrupt. And the other thing, I mean, you mentioned this earlier, but if we go full bore into a surveillance state, we're already a long way there. But people are talking about more cameras, more surveillance. But if we go to the total surveillance state, then it seems to me the terrorists have won. Then they've won at that point. So is that what people want? They need to think long and hard about that.
Yeah, and people sometimes ask me, well, what would happen if we just stopped? We came home. Wouldn't there people still be angry? Well, there might be, but I mean, the idea that they're going to go kill all the angry people and there's not going to be new angry people is ridiculous. I mean, we've seen that. From everything I've read so far, these two guys were nice, peaceful people that all of a sudden it's clear they just started getting filled with anger and rage over a period of time. But look at Iraq, Sheldon. We're out of Iraq. I don't see any Iraqis coming over here to attack us based on all the death and destruction that the U.S. state, national security state wreaked in Iraq. Vietnam, after killing a few million Vietnamese, once they got out, people go back to their lives. There's been no terrorist attacks by the Vietnamese people. So, yeah, theoretically there could be some, but I think most people just get back to their lives, try to rebuild their countries once the U.S. National security state just leaves them alone. I mean, that's what this battle's all about. They're saying, get out, go home, leave us alone. And the U.S. government's saying, it's our right to be over here interfering in your elections and your procedures and your government and regime change operations and sanctions, embargoes, and it's all rooted in what the U.S. government's doing over there, Sheldon.
Well, once again, I agree. There may be grievances, even if we totally, terminated the interventionist foreign policy, both in word and deed. Sure, there are some people that would still have grievances. Maybe they want to settle some scores. We can't guarantee that won't happen. But I think the government is really not very good at providing security like that. What's much better is a highly decentralized system, mainly people protecting their own property. And because government is a lumbering, blundering bureaucracy that's not going to be very good. I think this shows that. And so I think a combination of non-interventionist foreign policy and privatization of people's security over their own property will actually be the best shot we have at protecting Americans from terrorism. On the other hand, the idea that we can have a totally safe society, risk-free, is absurd. This has been pointed out in other contexts, but it's got to be pointed out here too. If you have a big open society, then there's always going to be some risk. The alternative is to try to close it, but even in a closed society, then you have maybe a slightly different kind of risk. So you never reach complete safety. That's something that should not be pursued, because you're going to create a lot of danger in the process of trying to pursue it, and you're never going to achieve what you want anyway.
Okay, Sheldon, on that note, we got to wrap it up. We're out of time. For those of you that are not familiar with the Future of Freedom Foundation, you're watching this broadcast, I'd like to invite you to come and see us at FFF.org and on our Facebook page at the Future of Freedom Foundation. We have an FFF Daily, which we strive to make the best libertarian internet page. It goes out daily. It's free for the asking. Just drop us an email or subscribe at our website. And then we've got a journal, a monthly journal, both print and email. That's by subscription. So invite you to be part of what we're doing. We're trying to change America. We're trying to move it in a better, freer, more prosperous, peaceful direction. We'd love to have your support. Thanks so much. That's the show, and we'll see you next week.